This is a video examining the storytelling of the most popular manga Shonen Jump in an attempt to learn from their successes and failures. I mainly created this for myself and for others who want to more fully understand how to create satisfying long-form stories. I will be spoiling major story elements for every series I mention, so consider this your warning in advance. Now, we may as well start at the beginning of Shonen as we know it. Dragon Ball created an entire genre almost single-handedly, and Akira Toriyama deserves all the respect in the world for it. But while he did many things well, there were also many mistakes made in this series that others would eventually make as well. The most prominent of these issues was escalation. Once Dragon Ball made a full transition into being predominantly an action series, Toriyama seems to have felt pressure to constantly one-up what he had done before. I'm not sure if that was just his own pressure or a pressure that his editors were putting on him, but that's how it comes across. Toriyama has gone on record stating that he really just made up the story as he went along, and honestly, he did an amazing job when you learn that's how he did it. It's genuinely impressive how his stories felt as tight as they did, despite his lack of planning. That takes real skill. However, I think that method eventually caught up with him. I think things went pretty well for a large portion of the series, but the real issues hit during the Frieza saga, specifically towards the end of it. Power levels began to dominate the story, as well as the concept of transforming into a stronger version of yourself. Neither of these ideas are inherently bad, in my opinion, but they're the easiest symptoms of the problem to point to. Escalating stakes quickly became synonymous with citing larger numbers instead of creating dramatic stakes, which I believe Akira Toriyama noticed, which is why he dropped power levels completely after Frieza was gone. What stuck around, however, was transformation. Heroes and villains alike were an aesthetic change away from an instant power-up, something that would become a staple of not only the entirety of Dragon Ball, but shonen anime and manga as a whole. Stakes need to rise? Transformation! Heroes need more power? Here's a new transformation. Now the villain needs a transformation to counter that transformation, and then, it goes on and on and on. But again, these are just easy symptoms to point at. The real problem is the entire idea that everything needs to constantly escalate to begin with. The fact is, an action story doesn't benefit from consistent escalation, because eventually the bigger a problem becomes, the less meaning it tends to have. This entire planet will be destroyed is technically a much bigger problem than if we don't win, a character we love will die. On paper, one obviously matters more. In practice, smaller, more personal stakes leave much more of an impact on the viewer and are much more satisfying when resolved. What do you remember most about Cell's defeat? Do you remember that the world wasn't destroyed, or do you remember Goku's death and that whole father-son Kamehameha thing that Gohan did, and the narrative of Gohan coming into his own as a fighter? I already know the answer, because the Gohan moment is so memorable that it's been remade in the movies and video games over and over and over again. Which is why the idea that stakes need to always be bigger is a fallacy. People don't care about that. They care about the characters. As long as it's personal to the characters and the audience is interested in it, that's all that matters. You can do the whole "we have to save the world" story, but it needs to always be tied to something personal, and if the story continues, there's nothing wrong with shrinking the story down and letting the next threat be something technically less important. One series that knows how to do this is Hunter x Hunter by Yoshihiro Takashi. It has an X in it, but apparently you're not supposed to pronounce the X. I think that's dumb, but that's apparently how it works, so whatever. Hunter x Hunter had a huge arc known as the Chimera Ant arc, where the fate of the entire world is at stake. Longtime supporting characters die, actual atomic bombs go off, and it's known that if the main characters fail to stop the villains, then the world may very well be over for humans. Then, when that arc concludes, we get a much smaller scale story about one of the major characters trying to heal his friend in the aftermath of the Chimera Ant arc. And some fans love that arc way more than the previous arc, feeling the Chimera Ant story was just too bloated and not personal enough. But, Hunter x Hunter is kind of a weird deconstructionist take on shonen anime. It is to shonen anime what Game of Thrones is to fantasy novels. It intentionally plays with the conventions of the genre and audience's expectations, challenging the norms in order to create something new. So let's take a look at some more mainstream stories. I recently finally experienced the story of One Piece by Eiichiro Oda. and he escalates and de-escalates the stakes constantly, but it's always made personal to the main characters, and that makes almost every story feel like it matters more to the audience. And in this show's case, what I would say is the arc with the most grand scale thus far was also the most personal one for its main character, all about him trying and failing to save his older brother. Something very personal that changes the character's outlook from that point on. It's also easily considered to have many of the best moments of the entire series, according to fans. The second biggest arc, the Dressrosa arc, is nowhere near as popular, as far as I can tell. And in what seems to be a consistent pattern, it also happens to be an arc that's filled with a much larger cast of characters who have personal stakes in the story, but aren't as well known to the audience themselves. It's not a bad story, however, even with the main characters sidelined a bit. Oda made sure to make it personal enough to keep people invested. Unfortunately, One Piece's contemporaries didn't handle their own stories quite as well. Naruto did its best to keep the stakes personal at the heart of it, and managed to do so adequately, even up to the very end in many cases. The first major arc was small by nature and was more about Team 7's personal growth as ninja than anything else. The Chunin exams arc grew in scale, but was filled with smaller, more personal stories about each of the kids that kept it consistently interesting as it went along. But the most memorable part of this entire arc was the moment Rock Lee fights Gaara, because you understand Rock Lee's personal struggles, and you're rooting for him to do well. Based on this one moment, Rock Lee is an extremely popular character in Naruto, and all he had was that, basically. He didn't really do anything else for the entire series, but he still remained very popular based on the strength of one moment that people were personally invested in. The series continues on from there, making sure every story is personally important to its main cast, and therefore the audience along the way. However, the scale kept getting bigger, and the cast kept growing, and eventually we ended up with a giant ninja war in order to save the world that has many very good moments, but is filled with so many side stories and extraneous characters that it begins to all run together, and the stakes get lost in the middle of all this, and eventually it just becomes much harder to stay invested. I read Naruto all the way to the end, but it was purely out of wanting to see the story of the characters I grew up with conclude, and it ended up kind of being a chore. Bleach, it handled this much worse. Tite Kubo, which apparently that's pronounced that way, I don't know why. Tite Kubo seems to understand the need to de-escalate when the story gets too big, and did so multiple times, but unfortunately didn't seem to get the memo when it came to personal stakes. Thing is, he handled this wonderfully in his first major arc, the let's just call it the Save Rukia arc. It was all about a group of teenagers trying to save their friend from being executed. That was always at the heart of the story, as well as the personal growth of all these teens that you've come to know and love. After that, however, Kubo played lip service to the need for personal stakes without really seeming to understand what made his first big story work so well. In his next big arc, all he did was basically create the exact same situation, except with a lot more distractions from the personal goal, and introducing way more characters, and in doing so making it harder for the audience to care about what's happening. The story lost focus, and the majority of Bleach's audience lost interest, leading it to be prematurely cancelled. However, I believe things are improving. If Dragon Ball was the first wave of shonen, I'd consider Naruto and One Piece and Bleach to be the second wave of shonen. Hunter x Hunter is kind of its own thing, it's too singular and weird to be included in these trends, but I believe that means the third wave of shonen is going to be led by shows like My Hero Academia seems to completely understand what needs to be done in order to remain engaging while also feel like the story is always moving. There hasn't been a single arc, I'd say, that hasn't been grounded in personal stakes that make the story feel impactful. Kohei Horikoshi understands what he's doing, and he's very good at it. I'm not going to get into the details with this one because I may just want to delve into My Hero Academia more deeply later, but I think it's a great way to kickstart this third wave of shonen. You know, My Hero Academia may end up being an exception, but I have a feeling that whatever big action manga end up headlighting Shonen Jump next will learn from the successes and mistakes of the anime and manga they loved growing up and do their best not to fall into the same trap. But, you know, we'll see.